Welcome, 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 one and all, to Impolite Company on the GCPR.live network. We're here to defy that old adage where you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics in Polite Company. That has not worked very well for the church or society. And so we talk about religion and politics here, and we have healthy conversations about them. You can send me your questions, your comments to contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. Love reading when people send me their questions, their comments. It's really helpful to get some direction and what you're all interested in. You can find previous episodes on podcast platforms like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can also find the video on YouTube. Just search for Impolite Company, look for that logo that's behind me. You can dive further into some more of the topics that we talk about by going to my blog at pastormatthewbest.com. And if you enjoy what we're doing here and you want to support the show, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/impolite company. And before we get into today's episode, I want to highlight the three things that I highlight every time before the show starts. You can show some love for Christ Lutheran Church in Harrisburg. That's the church that I am the pastor of. And what makes Christ Lutheran so special is that it is a community of healing. And why is that? Well, we have three free health clinics that we host out of this church. And since 2018, we've had 100,000 visits. I will tell you, from January through April of this year, we've seen a 50 visit increase every single month. So you can go to christharrisburg.org and check out Christ Harrisburg if you want to support the ministry. That would be greatly appreciated. Hear about homelessness? You can check out memorialblanket.org. That's a project where every year people make blankets from all over the place, across the world, and we collect them. We go to a specific location. We create an art installation to highlight homelessness, and at the end of the night, we hand out and give away all of the blankets. So that's memorialblanket.org. And lastly, if you're looking for a tool to help you with conversation around the difficult topic of gun violence, I would direct you to American Roulette. It's a book that I came up with and had the help of 9 other authors, and it's a fictional account about a mass shooting. We don't give any solutions, but we're trying to focus on something that isn't talked about so often, which is the humanity in the situation. Because it's my thought that if we focus on the humanity, it might change how we start dealing with this. So, with that, today I am really pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Roger Willer. And Roger is a pastor in the ELCA, serving as the Director of Theological Ethics in the ELCA office of the presiding bishop. He's worked in that capacity as lead or co-lead staff for every ELCA social teaching writing project since 2007. He has been a busy man. I know that much. He served 2 congregations early in his ministry and then earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2009 in theology. He's a contributing scholar in theology and ethics for both church and academic audiences. He has directed the task force working that is bringing the proposed statement of faith and civic life, seeking a well-being of all for consideration to the ELCA churchwide assembly in 2025, just a couple months from now, actually. So, Roger, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'm delighted to be here and appreciate the opportunity to be part of Impolite Company's conversation.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Good. Well, before we get into the statement, let's just talk a little bit, like kind of frame this a little bit in terms of civic life and faith. Like these are big topics. And it may be helpful for the audience to kind of get you before we started the show, you were talking about kind of a central image that you have around civic life. And so maybe you could share that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I do have a central image. Now that I've heard your opening spiel, I kind of think maybe we should have called this the impolite social statement because it is exactly what you said. In our society, we say you shouldn't talk about that's religion and politics, although it is much bigger than just politics. Right. And that's where I really want to start. Civic life is kind of like the air that we breathe. You know, we get up every day, It surrounds us. We depend on it. We participate in it. We don't think much about it. We take it for granted until something goes wrong, like it
Right.
smells, or the air is filled with wood smoke, or people with asthma know it's pretty serious. That's a desperate situation. Yeah, and the more common experience for us, all of us, is that we know about unhealthy air alerts, air quality. And I think civic life today is in a kind of unhealthy alert. There's a quality issue, and but even then, we don't see the big picture as much as we tend to focus on particular problems in
Yeah,
civic life. Like,
I'm wondering, Roger, what your thought is related to that. As far as, do you think part of this has to do with um, I don't know how to describe it, but almost like a shortened attention span, that it's kind of like we're hit with this and then we're hit with this and then we're hit with this and then we're hit with this, and so it doesn't give us the opportunity to kind of step back and just kind of take in the bigger picture with that. Does that make sense?
well, that's certainly part of it. That's certainly part of it, which is a nice segue into what social statements do,
Yeah.
because that's what we do is we take a step back in order to look at the biggest picture and the biggest issues. Um, and our statements are mindful of the particular problems, like the distrust of government, for
Yeah.
instance, that's widespread. Yeah. So and that's what our church tries to do with our social statements. And one of the issues that we do uh, deal with in terms of use of statements is that because they look at the big picture so much, people is like, oh, that's just too much for me. It's a hard read, and this
Yeah.
statement is no different because it is so large, because civic life is so broad.
Right. Maybe let's take a moment and talk a little bit about social statements a little bit more, in the sense of what is the role of a social statement in the denomination, and how do they come about, just to give
Yeah,
people who aren't as familiar with them.
sure, sure. Well, I want to step back even a little bit from that,
Yeah.
um, um, because what we have in our denomination, our ELCA, is what we call social teaching.
Hmm.
And social statements are one of three kinds of social teaching or policy documents. So there are statements, there are messages, and there are social policy resolutions. And we're going to focus on the social statement. Um, but in terms of the body of social teaching, probably the best well-known comparison would be the Roman Catholic social encyclicals.
Hmm.
When those come out, they garner media attention and they're in news reports. Uh, and ours fulfill the same function. We're not a world
Yeah.
denomination, and they have ours have a different kind of authority, and they're developed differently. It's a very participatory, democratic approach, but it has the same function to contribute to the teaching office of the church, which stretches back all the way to the scriptures. I mean, there's social
Right.
teaching in the scriptures. It's kind of often overlooked. So the statements um, address the changing circumstances of the world in light of God's living word, and they are tested according to their faithfulness to Scripture and to our confessions. And the statements are, like I used the word before, of framing. They address the great social institutions in which we live from the standpoint of our faith and our insights. So we have an education social statement. We have one on criminal justice. We have one on economic life. And we're doing one on civic life. So you get a sense of how big these
Right.
how big the attention is to these particular, but they give us this ability to think about whatever's happening in life in our society and to respond to them. And
Yeah,
then the social messages are more topical. And as I said, I'm not going to go into all that, but
sure.
that's why civic life is such a big social statement.
Yeah. And just so people know, they can find these. It's really just Google ELCA social statements. It'll bring you to the link, as opposed to try and direct you specifically on the website.
Right.
Google is wonderful. I'll help you out. And I really appreciate your description of what you're talking about, kind of the role of the social statements, and because I've encountered folks in different congregational type of settings who will, if they don't necessarily agree with something, they'll say, "Oh, that's just the church being political," or whatever the criticism is, without really having an understanding of how did this come about. I think oftentimes people have this assumption of, "Oh, this was a top-down type of thing, and it's being imposed on everybody else," which is like the common criticism whenever something is in the church that people don't like. Oh, it must have come from the top down, whether that's the presiding bishop's office or the synodical bishop or the pastor or whoever the case may be. When that's not the case, it's not how we operate. It's
Yeah.
always like it came from the grassroots and it wells its way up. It's kind of the reverse direction. But I want to get into some definitions about this, and we've done definitions on this show before because I think if we're going to talk about things, we need to make sure everybody's on the same page as far as what the words mean. Oftentimes, we're using these words and we're assuming that everybody has the same definition. And like in previous episodes, we've talked about, well, what is liberty? Well,
Mm,
like I have a different definition of what liberty is than like the Moms for Liberty do. Uh,
mm,
and
mm,
and so it's just important to do that. So, we're using this term civic life. You've talked a little bit about it, as far as kind of the air that we breathe in this larger thing. Are there other terms too? If you want to dive further into civic life, but are there other terms that you want to raise up specifically, right now when we're talking about kind of these ideas?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to, set the stage, as it were, with the description of what we're talking about. I mean, civic life is any activity that's not primarily individual, or any activity that does not happen within a family or a household or a private space. So a wedding reception is private. A parade is a matter of civic life. It's a
Yeah.
civic event. Um, so that, I think, helps folks to understand how broad we civic life is when we talk about it. It's from soccer coaching at the community center to international uh, economic life. And the World Health Organization, all of those are engaged in civic life matters. And I think the other thing, so when we say faith and civic life, that's what we have in mind for the term civic life. And the term well-being is also a term that the statement spends some time unpacking, because the understanding we have is that it denotes God's intent for the whole, healthy, peaceful, just relations among all elements in society and in creation, for that matter. But
Hmm.
we're focused, on society.
Sure.
And a lot of times, people, when they think well-being, they think of, how am I? you
Yeah.
know
Right.
am i
Right.
am i self-satisfied, am I satisfied, self-fulfillment. But we're talking about well-being as God's intention for society, that's universal, that's a matter of wholeness, a state of affairs, in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, but for everybody.
So kind of that sense of shalom. on that kind of grand scale. That to me, I
That's
always
right.
I think about like when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, he's talking about shalom in that sense, and
Right.
just
Right.
using different words with it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's
It's aspirational,
right.
but we think that well-being is worth aspiring to.
Yeah.
And when I say we, I'm talking very much out of what the statement says.
Right.
It's just easier to talk about,
Sure.
we and I and so forth. Um, but it's both aspirational, but it's also a worthwhile goal and in some fashion a doable goal. We
Yeah.
could, our society could do a lot better at creating well-being for all.
Yeah. That's for sure. So I do I want to talk a little bit about politics and partisanship. And because
Okay,
again, like I hit these so often,
sure.
because people will equate the two, and they're not the same thing. Just to be fair, what I usually talk about is politics is kind of the process of how decisions are made, kind of in that
Hmm.
sense. And so, whether it's we're talking about an election, like the actual act of voting and counting and all that type of stuff, or like how a group of people are going to make a decision. What is the
Hmm.
process that they're going to go about? That's typically what I think about in terms of politics. It's kind of the very much a process oriented type of thing, and it does deal with power. It deals with a sense of control. It deals with all these type of things, but they're kind of like a tool. Politics is a tool, kind of no different than like a hammer is a tool. Partisanship, the way that I usually talk about it, is the sense of, well, partisanship is related to politics. It's certainly in that kind of larger realm of politics, but partisanship has to do with trying to, you're talking about political parties,
Hmm.
and what they're trying to accomplish, which is typically to get certain people elected to office, to raise money, to draw attention to some kind of often ideological ends to that. I'm curious, how would you define those
Yeah.
terms?
And again, it's not what I defined, it's what the
Yeah,
statement
right.
says,
Sure.
just to be clear. And I think the statement agrees with your understanding of politics. I'll say a little bit more.
Yeah,
Um, it also doesn't de uh, de decry partisanship,
sure.
which was kind of hinted at in what you
Yeah,
said.
yeah,
What it really decries and is what we call hyperpartisan polarization. So let me
right.
talk about a little bit about
Yeah,
all
yeah,
those. So politics, I really like the statement, and this is in the statement. Politics is the activity through which people exercise decisions about who gets what, when, where, and how
yeah.
in order to fulfill the purpose that all may have well-being.
That's beautiful. I
That's
just
a
want to say that's
different
a
way.
beautiful. That's beautiful. That's that aspirational, the ideal of what
Yeah,
what politics can be.
right, right. And uh, commonly, politics is sort of equated with conniving,
Right,
deceitful, um, dominating power,
right,
controlling. And hey, that happens in
right,
politics. That happens in other places besides the government realm. And
right,
I do want to stress that the social statement is not just about government and politics.
right.
We got to talk, it's part of it, but it is important to make that. So then partisanship, by the dictionary definition, is just a strong loyalty to a specific party or group. Nothing wrong with that. That's a natural thing. And in fact, we are political creatures, the statement
Right.
says. That's the way God created us.
Yeah.
We have to decide who gets what, when, where, and how, um, for the purpose that all may
Right.
flourish, may have well-being. Um, there is then blind adherence to in terms of partisanship. Um, but what we really see, what the statement really says is we've moved into a new phase as a society that in the statement's called hyper-partisan
Hmm.
polarization.
Yeah.
And this is not just ideas that we came up with, because this task forces listen to and read a lot of experts and so forth. And the point we came to understand is that political identities, which have been around from the
Hmm.
very beginning, even though the founding parents of our country said, no, we won't have any political parties.
Yeah.
Within a few years, there were the
Right.
Federalists and yeah. So, but the political identity, it now gets linked with other identifications
Right.
such as religion, sexual orientation, race, urban, rural, cable news preferences,
Right.
even what restaurants, one
Yep.
frequents.
Yep.
So these mega identities are what cause the problem that we have, along with a an impoverished understanding of power
Yeah.
as control, as a win-lose situation. And the statement picks up power, which we should talk about a little bit further into
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but those
It's
those are the kinds of the definitions or descriptions that we use in the statement.
it's reminding me, Roger, of I'm trying to remember who it might have been. Michael Medved back in like the 90s wrote an article, and I can't remember where I read it or anything like that, but he talked about kind of the like the death of the meta narrative. I don't think he used that terminology, but
Mm,
he was talking about then of when was the last epic movie that everybody went to? The only thing
mhm,
that kind of we have in common is, as far as a shared cultural experience, is the
mhm.
Super Bowl, is pretty much what he was
Right.
talking about, right? And so what we've seen is kind of this shift to these kind of smaller groupings. And part of that is, like we have individual choice as far as our entertainment. We have individual choice in this, that, and the other thing. And so it becomes all these disconnected identities. And so this is a way to do this, especially with a decline of the membership of church. Other things have taken that place as far as a form of identity in that.
Mm,
And I
mhm,
just kind of
mhm.
hear that in what you're saying about what the statement is trying to address in that. So
Yeah, I think we don't go into the deep rationale or
fair.
so forth, but we recognize this a as a harm
Yeah.
to our society, to our ability to have conversations with one another,
Yeah.
um, and to church, and to use churches as, to have conversations within the church, because we're so tied to these, hyper partisan identities that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. That just shuts down conversation so quickly. Yeah.
And it
So
shouldn't be happening in the church. And this statement is very clear about
right.
this, because our unity is a unity in diversity,
Right.
because it's a unity in Christ.
Yep.
And it's not based on the fact that you and I agree about something. It's a really interesting statistic. In the
Yeah.
60s, it was like, and this is very
Yeah. Sure.
approximate, but in the 60s, 40% of people were unhappy if their children married
Right.
someone from a different religion.
Right.
So, and 5% of the people were unhappy if someone married a person of a different political party.
Yeah.
Now it's flipped.
Right.
So 5% of the people are unhappy if they marry someone of a different religion, but 40%, 35% are unhappy if they marry someone of a different political party. That is a significant thing to think about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that has a lot of potential for very destructive um, and damaging just as a whole on
Hmm.
society. So,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
really kind of addresses why do we need this statement? I think you just really kind of talked about it right there. This is such an important. To me, I think this is one of the more important social statements that we have put out because it's not hitting a particular topic. It's really kind of a larger umbrella that says, how do
Hmm.
we even talk about different things, right? It's giving this kind of model for how do we go forward? How do we talk about important issues? How do we interrelate with each other? How are we going to make decisions? And so it's a much larger. To me, it just hits a larger um, topic. Isn't the right word, but
It's a larger umbrella,
it's a
perhaps.
larger umbrella,
Yeah, yeah,
more
it's one
so
of the
than
biggest.
than any of the other social statements that the church has dealt with, and I think it gives a good model for how to go forward with that.
Yeah,
So that's
it's
my
kind of
that's my little
interesting. Yeah,
commercial.
kind of interesting because in some ways it's a bookend to the first
Yeah,
social statement was church and society, a Lutheran perspective,
yeah,
and it just sent out some very key ideas from
right,
a Lutheran perspective about how we engage in society. This is congruent with those
right.
ideas, but elaborates it into questions about how do we assess the US Constitution? What does this church say about religious liberty? Um, how do we describe civic life? What is the proper role for pastors when they're speaking about public issues in the pulpit or to the society, to media and so forth? And what's the proper constructive relationship between religious organizations and government?
Hmm.
So all of those are in some the kind of sections of this statement, and you
Yeah.
can see just how it draws from the initial stuff of the first bookend to this big umbrella that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive in a little bit.
Okay.
And again, I would encourage people Google the statement. It is faith and civic life, seeking the well-being of all. And so people can go back in and they can take a look at what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I want
Um,
to,
yeah,
before you go on, I do want to say it is a big statement,
right,
but we've made an easy entrance into it. So the very beginning, there is an annotated contents the statement is set out in 49 articles. You don't have to read from the beginning to the end
right.
or from the beginning to the middle to get to what you're interested in. If you look at the annotated contents page and you say, well, I'm really interested to hear what the church, thinks about Christian nationalism or about civic education, you can find that easily in the two or three sentences about each one of the articles, and you click on that link and it will take you right to that particular article.
The other thing I want to mention before we get in is this may, for people who aren't ELCA and are listening, they may be going, well, what's this got to do with me? Um, um, but honestly, I think these are important things to get a sense, even if somebody isn't ELCA, to read some of this to get a sense of what are your ELCA neighbors and congregations? What's the thought process going on?
Mhm,
So you
mhm,
can interact. No different than like taking a look and seeing what statements from other denominations are and being
mhm,
familiar with them, so that you have a sense of, well, what are the beliefs? What are the statements? What's the public side of things? It's kind of like what was this is just happened just recently, was the Episcopal Church, and they had issued a statement about white refugees coming from South Africa, and if they wouldn't uh, be working, and all that. Like, it's an important thing for people to know, whether you're an Episcopal or not. of
Hmm. Hmm.
what's that church body thinking in that. And I kind of think this is in a similar realm of for people that have a sense of if we're talking about civic life, this is the civic life aspect of it, and not a it doesn't always uh, we're not directly affected by all the things going on in civic life. But again, this kind of goes with what you're talking about, is this is the wider
Right,
thing that
right.
we're talking about, and we are connected to
Yeah.
that wider. So I
Well,
just
and
wanted to mention that.
sure. And we write our social statements. I often put it this way. This comes from our church, and it is to our church, but it's also a proposal to the wider society about how to regard issues like the US Constitution
Yeah,
or the nature of civic life. Some of it's, of course, very much focused on our church, but it's also a proposal for wider discussion when we talk about what's the proper relationship between religious organizations and government. That's not just about the
right,
ELCA.
right.
That's a proposal for others to think about and say, yeah, that kind of makes sense, and I like those criteria. Or no, not quite,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. I mean, religions historically have spoken eh, often about the richest, deepest, thickest aspirations and visions for what is good and what society ought to be. And we're part of that in what we set forth in our social statement. It's not
Right,
just for our own people. Yeah.
right. And this is also kind of this is a much more um, organized and intentional way of going about this,
Hmm.
because this
Hmm.
stuff happens all the time,
Right.
just usually not in an intentional way. Kind of like I think about all the things, the statements and whatnot that come out related to uh, those that are in support of Christian nationalism are always putting out things and
Hmm.
statements about what it is, and so like this is a way to be engaged in that conversation with it.
Hmm.
So let's dive into to this. So when people are looking at section one, there's a distinct foundation that the section is really rooted in, which is shalom. We talked a little bit about that, right?
Yeah.
Which I was so happy, I was so very happy to see in there. And I've mentioned, I talk about that a lot. Other concepts that are in here are the image of God, relationship, trust, the common good, kind of all those things you talked about as far as well-being in this, which takes a great shift because it's not I think it helps move people away from a focus on politics in the sense that they're inundated on a daily basis, versus, well, what is the church talking about? And there's also talk about sin, in the sense of sin warping all of these things, in our relationship, and so it creates a lot of problems, of course. I appreciate the statement rooting itself in these very deep theological and faith
Hmm.
ideas,
Hmm.
because so often faith and civic life end up being about, they end up being debates about specific issues and where people stand on those issues, and then saying, "Oh, you're not a Christian because you're this, or you're this." So there's opportunity for difference. How challenging would you say this concept of the common good, because that's really what we're dealing with in a society? Yeah, how challenging is it for even people to pay attention or to grasp the sense of common good in a society that is so very grounded in individuality? And sometimes that individuality goes to a toxic level, and sometimes there's a healthy individuality in there.
Hmm.
How would you, what would you think about
Well, the first thing I want to say is it's clear to me you've read the statement very carefully, and I'm
that? Yes.
uh, I'm delighted because you've mentioned many of the
Yeah.
key ideas. There's a couple other sort of more Lutheran oriented ones like God's two different strategies of law and
Right.
gospel. But your question is really penetrating as well because we if we're going to talk about the good of society, the well-being of society, that has to put an emphasis on community and on the all,
Right.
not just on what's good for me. And in some ways, and that really is shot through the whole statement. We are arguing that God's intention is for community, for the well-being of all through the whole statement. And that affects how we understand what politics should be about, what the use of power should be about. In the statement, for instance, we talk about one place that where there's a kind of contemporary understanding of the golden rule
Yeah.
that we should extend to others the self-determination that I wish for myself. So extend to others in a mutuality, not
Yeah.
my versus you, but in a mutuality, extend to them self-determination as I wish to have it extended to me,
Hmm.
which takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
We're not unrealistic about it, but there are clear examples that that does happen and that that can happen, and that that ought to be the kind of driving concern for society. And that's
Yeah.
grounded, as you say, in the sense of God is the creator of all, God is the creator of society, God is the one who makes us political creatures. Uh, and God, God's concern is not just about which souls get to heaven, but about what happens in the creation and in the society that God is active in. I mean, that's
Right.
one of the other big differences about the statement. From the very beginning, it says society is God's business. God is
Mm.
there. God is at work.
Yeah.
Um, and then it clarifies what that means, this idea of well-being, and that's that which is God's intention, and so forth. So those are key ideas, and it is probably the toughest thing to come back to your original questions, probably the toughest thing to get beyond this individualism that is just so present. And in a way, to go back to my image, I think the individualism, is like an unhealthy air alert. I mean, that you can
Yeah.
part there's so many particles that are toxic
Yeah.
from this individualism that it really degrades the quality of civic life. And yet human beings depend first upon civic life
Yeah.
and only secondary about themselves. And there has to be a balance and a tension.
Sure.
But we in this society have largely lost the sense of the value of community, which is so deeply lifted, so deep in Scripture and so lifted up by Scripture.
Yeah. When I hear that, I hear kind of the tension that like I've seen a meme about this, but it kind of captures the idea of are we Americans or are we Christians? And it doesn't mean that we're not both of those, but what becomes the foundational creed of how we live. And I to be really careful with that for folks because some people may be like, well, what are you saying to be anti-American? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying
And
our
neither is the
right.
statement.
Right. Absolutely. Like I didn't read that in there. It's this idea of if we're going to be, that aspirational idea that the church has always been trying to be, which is we united in Christ, one body, many parts. then that has to supersede everything else. And that allows us to then be good citizens. That allows us because this is kind of to use a theological term. We can be in right relationship with each other, and then that allows
Hmm.
us to be in right relationship with the rest of society, with government, with whatever country that we're a part of, all those type of things.
Hmm.
Jesus is not just Lord of the United States. Jesus is Lord of all, and that's what we belong to in that. And I think oftentimes when so much of these challenges uh, that come up and the unhealthy conversations come up, it's because of this kind of the water has been muddied as far as what does it mean to be a Christian versus what does it mean to be an American, and saying, well, if you're, in order to be an American, you have to be a certain version of Christian and all of this. And that's where we get a lot of problems because now our our loyalty is to a different idea than what it is. We're supposed to be part of God's kingdom, and that's what we're really trying to bring about. I mean, I've even preached this in the pulpit that at some point the United States of America will not exist. It's a safe statement to say
Go
I'm not.
figure.
Right? I mean, because it's human made, and at some point it will cease to exist. I'm not looking, to say, tear it down and all that type of stuff. It's just a reality that, you go back 100 years, 90% of the countries in the world did not exist. And so at some point, same thing with like, these two political parties, these two primary political parties that we have will not exist at some point. And so, why would our ultimate loyalty and identity be attached to these things? It's not an argument of whether they're good or bad. It's just is that really where our identity should be attached to versus our identity is in something more eternal.
Hmm.
And you
Hmm.
can be a part of these other things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But don't let that become your identity with that. And I feel like just from reading it, I get that sense that that's what the statement is really kind of trying to address, is to redirect people back to a sense of some clarity with, look, our identity is here and this is what unites us. This is what brings us together. This is where we have a commonality, and this is what allows us to participate in society in that way. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I guess I'd use a couple different words,
Yeah.
but your basic assessment, um, we are Christians first,
Hmm.
and nothing else can become close even, let alone above that.
Yeah.
We are Christians first. Um, but then being a Christian, and this is where I'd say use some different words than what you
Yeah. Yeah.
did. Because God is active in society, seeking the well-being of all, God summons us
Mm.
into that society to work toward the well-being of all.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just allow, that's where I took
Right.
issue, and
Yeah.
yours
Yeah.
may
Yeah.
have just been your choice, but it's an actual summons. And I think that's an important distinction. It's
Yeah.
not just, okay, now we're allowed, we're actually
Right.
summoned into the society to make it work for all people, to make sure that politics does what it's supposed to do, to make sure that the civic community center is available for everybody, to
Yeah.
make sure, and you just could go on, to go back to the mutual self-determination, which is a key concept, to make sure that what I think is important for my ability as part of a group to self-determine, I extend to other groups to help them also self-determine. And this is rooted, and this is getting deep into the theory here, but this is rooted in the understanding of God's power
Yeah.
that the statement sets forth. Because power often, particularly in the political realm, is a controlling or a domination. I win, you lose.
Yeah.
But God's power, um, I mean, the statement says all power is grounded in God, who is all powerful,
Hmm.
and the church teaches that any use of power can be assessed by whether it amplifies God's purpose for peoples and groups. You know, and that's very different from the usual political model.
Right. Right.
And but it's grounded in this understanding of who we are as God's people in Christianity, and in particular, this understanding of divine power as um, as creating multiplicity, as creating surplus, as creating mutuality, is really central to the confession's theology of creation,
Yeah.
justification by grace, the Lord's Supper, all of that
Right.
is there. So the statement's drawing from some of the deepest resources of our Lutheran heritage in putting this forth, and then saying, how does that affect politics and our understanding of power and so forth? And that
Yeah.
uh, the statement, I think, does a good job of doing a kind of analysis of power and what are the criteria for it to be used.
Yeah. What I hear in that, and first of all, I agree with what you just said about instead of allowing and more summoning, kind of like a calling.
Mm.
Um, and if I would go back, I would probably use that language. So I appreciate that. But what I hear is kind of God's power is outward focused and always empowering others, right?
That's
Because
right.
that's what well-being would
That's
be,
right.
right? Versus
Read
how,
Genesis. Read
right,
Genesis.
right,
Read
absolutely. It's this
the
kind of
Exodus.
outward. It's
Read
always outward.
Jesus. I mean,
Yep.
yeah.
And versus when and this kind of gets into, like, I have this visual of Martin Luther's definition of sin is turning inward on oneself, and it's kind of like this looking in on your belly button. And so power kind of goes the same way. Is it going outward and being shared and being utilized and
And
empowering
multiplied.
and
And
multiplying and
multiplied.
expanding and all
Key
that,
thing.
right? Or is it being kind of hoarded?
Hoarded.
Yeah, and for one's own use, which never ends up working. Like have people never seen like a James Bond movie before or anything like that? Like it never works out. Anyway, all right, I want to move on
Yeah,
to
there's
the
nothing about James Bond in the statement, so
no,
I don't know.
no, that's fine. You never thought there would be a reference to James Bond in there, but anyway, I want to go to section two because in there it talks about, and this is kind of continuing on with what we were just talking about God's call for all people with,
Mhm.
robust participation in the civic life. And there's a whole range of thought about how Christians engage in civic life, from one end of the spectrum where some believe that Christians are not supposed to participate at all the way to the other end of the spectrum, if you want to think about it that way, where some might argue that the church should dictate civic life over people, more of
Mm.
a theocracy type of thing,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
the modern version of that of Christian nationalism. Um, it's because it's not anything new. Where does the statement fall in that range, and why?
Mm. Mhm. Well, let me back up a second.
Yeah.
And because you rightly talk about the sense of Christian vocation,
Hmm.
but the statement is bigger than that, and this goes back to earlier our conversation earlier about speaking to all people,
Yeah.
because the statement says from we see that God intends for all people to that let's put it this way, that all people are summoned to help make society work for the well-being of all. So that, and this is a very Lutheran thing,
Hmm.
that that all people are God's instruments in the creation and running of a society that works for all. That's God's intention, and that it applies to everybody.
Right.
Christians in their relationship with God go, aha, I'm not supposed to be turned in on myself.
Right.
I'm called to love my neighbor, to seek neighbor justice. So it's not just individual, but it's also
Hmm.
social. Um, and that's what, because, oh my goodness, God is already out there doing this stuff. God is at work trying to bring society, trying to make society uh, fulfill its intentions. Um, and so the the statement is very clear that there's different ways to do it. I mean, all some people are able to do is to pray
Right.
for civic life because for whatever reason, um, whereas others have a calling to public service. So, your question was, where does the statement come down? We are all called, summoned to be, to live out our calling. That's everybody, and Christians are particularly keenly aware of it, or should be, to serve the well-being, or to, let's use the terms, seek the well-being of the society in whatever situation, you find yourself at that moment.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's not really, in some ways, it's not on the spectrum. What
Yeah.
you're able to do may be on the spectrum,
Hmm.
but all of us have a common calling to serve in the well-being of civic life, in whatever way it's possible for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. I'm gonna skip past section 3 and 4 because I'm limited on time. I only got about 12 minutes left. And all these sections, and just to give people a sense of what's in those, and again, I encourage people to read it. It's section 3 assesses the U.S. constitutional form of government. It's an important aspect. Not saying it's not important. And section 4 deals with religion and the First Amendment. Again, really important. I want to get to section 5 and 6.
Okay.
And 6 deals with a variety of contemporary issues in civic life. And 5 focuses on constructive relationships between religious organization and political authority, which I think kind of is continuing on with what we were talking about. I think what I really appreciate about this section is that isn't just condemning unhealthy relationships between religious organizations and civic government, like Christian nationalism, the idea of the
Hmm.
two being blended together, which is important to do, but also highlights how there can be constructive relationships between uh, religious organizations and and civil government. Um, I- that's number one. It's just so important because we don't hear about that enough.
Mm.
Like or it ends up being kind of twisted in a partisan way is
Yeah.
what ends up happening, as opposed to looking at it in a broader way. Um, because you got examples of this. There have been plenty of examples of this where there have been services provided for immigrants or hunger or poverty, those type of things, where there's been a positive relationship of government contracting with religious organizations to provide
Mhm.
those services, and that can work out really well. I mean, the church that I serve, we don't get government funding, but I will tell you that we partner with a lot of different folks
Mhm.
in order to make sure people get health care. So we're talking about a contrast between a healthy, constructive, well-being relationship for the purpose of promoting uh, the common good, the general welfare, versus an unhealthy relationship that's more focused on ensuring ideological or theological purity, or that
Mm.
hyper partisan aspect of loyalty and belief. And so the statement, the statement identifies that purity aspect as a form of idolatry
Hmm.
in there. And I'm just wondering if you could just say a little bit more about why the statement decided to go there and why that's so important.
Let me just clarify why
Yeah.
this statement decided to talk about the relationship of religious
No,
organizations
more
and something like
the
that.
idea of this is like a form of idolatry of this the unhealthy aspect
Aha.
of that.
Okay. Well, let's talk about what healthy is
Yeah,
first.
sure.
And it's one of the terms you didn't use, but is in that particular article is, what's a healthy form of patriotism,
Right,
right?
right,
And I think that's so. Let's start with what's healthy. I mean, patriotism is, by definition, love of one's country,
right.
praying for its well-being, committed
hmm
to its good values,
Right.
to have a sense of pride in it, but also to criticize it
Sure.
and to work for its reform, when that's necessary. And all of these are, when it comes to relating to nations or to societies, you see all of these things in Scripture. So
Right.
it's very much rooted. Um, but there's also in health, when something is healthy, there's a humility
Yeah.
about the country. Just use country, and there's a clarity about its strengths and its failures, about its history and its
Yep.
aspiration. And there's also, and then again, this is also very biblical. There is no exclusiveness in that patriotism. Exclusive says America above all.
Right. Right.
That's not healthy patriotism.
Right.
Um, a the unhealthy patriotism gives a special status to
hmm
my country,
hmm
um, saying, in God's eyes, this country has special status. No, a healthy patriotism is it's America along with others. God loves all countries. God is at work in all societies. Um, and then you say, where is this society or that society doing well or not doing well in terms of the criteria, which the statement tries to set out
Yeah.
very clearly. So that's healthy. Um, and one of if notice that when I talk about exclusion, that's that then becomes this purity thing that you were
hmm
asking about.
hmm
Because if it's exclusive, then there's a certain take on the purity of our stuff. Maybe
Right.
even it's not because of what we did, it's because of what God did, but that is not a biblical way to go, because God is the God of all countries, and there are strengths and weaknesses in all of those. So if we
hmm
can get past the idea of exclusive, we're the best
hmm
for whatever reason. If we can get past privilege, then we get past the purity sense. And
Yeah.
Lutherans at our best are very clear that purity is not possible for human beings,
That's for sure.
because we know that sin is shot through everything,
Right.
even the best of our stuff as human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why the statement has a certain take on things, how it gets shaped, because of that strong sense of sin, which you pointed out is in the very first section.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, we got 5 minutes left. Um,
Well,
so
we did say it's a big
I
document, didn't
know
we?
it is. It is absolutely. So
And a big
real
topic.
quick, real quick, section 6, dealing with contemporary
Hmm.
issues in there. So, you're talking about things like hyper-partisan polarization, modeling constructive civic leadership, truth telling, really important. The influence of money is in there, specifically in politics and elections and all that. Common good versus political personal interests, government relationships with territories and indigenous peoples, and civic education. That's There's a whole lot of topics that I'm sure each of those could end up having their own statement if you want to think, or there's a teaching document essentially that could come out of all of those. Um, and I can see how those are certainly all related to the rest of the statement. So I'm just curious, real quick, if you can answer this in like 2 minutes, why were these topics specifically chosen? And were there other ones that were suggested but didn't seem to make sense to fit into that section?
Sure. Short answer, and I
Yeah.
can occasionally be short. Um, a number of the topics that people said we should talk about have already been addressed in other social statements or social messages or social policy resolutions.
Okay.
Second piece is that there we tried to surface as a task force what are the really hot button issues
Hmm.
that the church hasn't spoken about that
Okay.
come under the purview of civic life.
Yeah.
And for those reasons, we chose these. We had specialists come in and talk to us about all of them. And then we developed some, some material so that they are registered in the church's teaching.
Okay. All right. Well, and that was a short answer, Roger. Very good. Very good. But it really kind of addressed that. So, with the last couple of minutes that we have, any last things that you want to say about the statement, about civic life in general, anything that you want to share with folks?
Yeah, how do I say? Um, the first thing I should say is we need to be clear again, as you were at the very beginning, this is not official teaching of our church yet. It
Right.
comes before our church-wide assembly. And the other
Which
thing
will, which will be in August.
July 28th is
Or
when it starts.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, yeah. And they will consider it, and they have the options like a legislative piece. They
Sure.
can amendment and so forth. Um, I think that there's been a lot of affirmation for it, so I don't think there's going to be major changes, but
Yeah.
that's up to the assembly because these are documents that emerge, as you said, they bubble up out of the everyday life of people and their concerns, and we develop them with the task force and with three major points of interaction from the whole church. People can participate. We've literally had thousands of people
Hmm.
make comments on this document. So that's
Yep.
how it gets tested. Um, other than that, I would say it is like riding a wave because this is all just so much in people's minds.
Yeah.
And it's been quite a ride.
Yeah. Yeah. I can appreciate that. And I know the church is the statement on child welfare is coming up as well, right?
Okay, that's a message.
Right. I
That's
see. Sorry about
that,
that.
which means,
It's the
and if you think about it, child protection is a much more is
right.
a topic, not
Right.
a huge
Yep.
social institution. So there's a
Right.
good example of it.
Yep.
Yes, we are working on a message on child protection that comes not to the assembly but to the church council, just a
Right.
different way of
Right.
handling it. Yeah.
Yep. Good stuff. Well, Roger, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation about civic life and faith and this statement. And this is such an important topic, and so I really appreciate you taking some time to come on and talk about it.
Well, I hope it's obvious I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that it will push people to take a look and find the issues they're interested in and read, and get a sense of the whole thing because it is it's speaking to the church from the church, but also to the wider society uh, um, of how our civic life could better seek the well-being of all.
All right, great. Well, with that, everyone, we thank you for tuning in and we'll catch you pretty soon. All right, bye.